Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. If you are like me, you have probably been involved in countless conversations over the last few years about how artificial intelligence will reshape culture. Will the design industries exist if AI can create this kind of work? What other jobs might vanish? Will AI cure cancer, or will it bring the end of the world as we know it? It's easy to fall into these binaries when we talk about artificial intelligence, and really when we talk about technology generally. We've all had countless conversations like this for the last decade or two about social media, about algorithms, about platforms, about smartphones. We often look at the tech, the tool, the platform, the product, and make a judgment about what it gives us and what it takes away. And often these critiques fail to evaluate the magnitude of how the ideologies behind them, the ideologies of Silicon Valley, have seeped into every aspect of our lives. This, though, in many ways, is what Mike Pepi's new book, Against Platforms: Surviving Digital Utopias, is about. I read a lot about tech in Silicon Valley. I worked in Silicon Valley over a decade ago, but I rarely felt a desire to discuss it head on this show until I was reading Mike's book. Against Platforms is a work of technology criticism, but it's also a meta critique about how we talk about technology. It's a book about criticism. Mike believes we need to avoid these binaries we often resort to, and perhaps more importantly, he believes we need to look beyond the products themselves and really critique the institutions, the culture, the people who make them. When we do that, we aren't just talking about the tech anymore, but also about culture, about language, about writing, about criticism, about design. This is very much what I'm interested in, so I invited Mike on the show to talk about it. Mike is a technologist, but he's also an art critic who has written about the intersection of art and culture and technology for publications like Frieze, Art in America, Artforum, the Brooklyn Rail, and many, many others. In this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the role of criticism as a way to imagine new worlds. We talk about the ideology of Silicon Valley and why technology can't solve cultural problems. We talk about why marketers and designers might be more to blame for the rise of platform capitalism than the engineers. And unfortunately, we also talk about Elon Musk and Doge. Mike is engaged in an important project, I think, and one very relevant to this moment and to the conversations I have on this show all the time. It's not a typical episode, but one that speaks to the topics that are probably on so many of our minds all the time. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support it by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everyone, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everyone. Our paying subscribers truly enable us to do this work and keep the show going. So if you want more of it in the world, please consider signing up and supporting our work. Thank you so much for listening. And here is my conversation with Mike Pepi. You are not at face value the usual type of guest that I would have on the show. Your book is not, I think, immediately reads as a type of book that I would have on this show. And so I was reading your book, and I was reading it for pleasure, first of all. And then I got to page 8, and I want to read to you something that you wrote on page 8. You write, "This book believes in the radical power of criticism. Criticism, even criticism that is produced for its own sake, has its greatest utility when used to uncover ideological formations that have already begun to blur into the subconscious assumptions of everyday life. Good criticism does not need to provide a blueprint, but it creates the conditions for which the blueprint might spring forth. Before we can act, we need the language with which to speak." And so as soon as I got to that, I was like, oh, we're speaking the same language here. Now I'm interested. So I read a lot of books about technology. like you, I worked in tech for a time. It never quite felt like something that I should talk about on this show until I read that line. So I kind of want to begin there. What is the power of criticism? Why is criticism so central to this argument that you're making in the book?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I think there's a big debate on what criticism should do and what criticism should call for and how prescriptive criticism should be. And when I was writing the intro to the book, sort of kind of after I had written the book slash in the middle of the process, I said I was sort of trying to do what any introduction does, is set the stakes for the reader, set their expectations. So they didn't come away from the book asking for a how-to or a prescriptive set of steps, or even necessarily, I don't even think I give that many great examples of the sort of inverse of the criticism that I'm laying out. And I think sometimes in modern writing or modern criticism, you get accused of being a hater or someone who's
Mm,
just kind of tearing down and not proposing any positive solutions. And I disagree with that philosophically. I think I wanted to write a book that was enjoyable to read from a critical perspective, in the sense that the reader does the work in between the lines of what I write. So I'm not gonna have the final chapter be a how to. I'm not gonna have the final chapter be, here's the people that are doing it right. Silicon Valley is doing it wrong. Here's what we do. I find writing, or I find this book to be much more generative if it allows the reader to connect the dots and, like I say, like allow the blueprint maybe to spring forth from that. So, that's why I put it that way. And that's, what I hope the book does.
we'll get into what you actually talk about in the book, but I want to stay on this kind of meta level of
Yeah, yeah,
criticism for a second. I'm wondering if you can tell me more about this idea of criticism creating the conditions for which the blueprint might spring forth. Before we act, we need language. The reason I want to hear more about that is I'm struck by this idea that we often think about criticism, like you said, as being the hater or being responding to something. We'll
yeah.
get into your art criticism in a bit too, but this idea you're looking at something, you're looking at an object, you're watching a film, you walk through a building, and then criticism is responding to that. But what I'm hearing in that definition, creating the conditions, that criticism is also, like you said, is generative, it's world building in some way. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about how you think about that, the role of criticism as a type of world building, or kind of you know the first
Yeah.
step of a conversation instead of the last step in the conversation.
Yeah. So I think when I think about that, um, the missing piece in a lot of political action is not necessarily the specific steps or the organizing action. It is really this larger popular imagination that has to be the ground upon which change starts from, right? So, particularly with this book, as you go through it, it's kind of a deconstruction or an unlearning or a revelation to this sort of, I think, in some cases hidden, other times not so hidden ideology of
Yeah.
of digital utopia. So what I'm trying to say here is the first step is acknowledging the precise ways in which these ideologies are enacted, or these ideologies kind of like have their bearing and like and operate. That is what I want. That language, I find there's still more work to do. There's still more work
Hmm. Hmm.
for a broad swath of society to more critically engage with the platforms they work with, and also more critically engage in thinking about how to build the future that they want. And so what I say when I say that language is I think in another part of the book I sort of say like language potentially is the only technology that we need to undo the
Yeah.
technology's effects, right? So
The only technology that can unseat the pace of digital utopianism is language itself,
right,
is what
right.
you write.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and I guess that's a very haughty defense of criticism and language, right? But I do believe that, right? I think it's important. I'm gonna have to look this up later, but there's a famous quote. I think it's either Vuflin or Winkelmann, one of the two, like really important early art criticism, really art no sorry art history and art philosophers, has this line where it's basically, not everything is apparent to everyone in history, right? Like we often make the mistake that people in Quattrocentro Europe just had these ideas that we now have after. Like all art needs to exist, and all sort of the intellectual history, all art needs to exist in kind of a like a teleology, right? So what I think is you have to plant this seed, you have to plant this critical consciousness before you can really do anything. And what I think the problem in the world of tech criticism now is that we have a fetishization of solutions. So we want to know what to do to fix it. And I argue that's actually part of the techno fix fallacy. What I'm trying to do with this book is slow down and have folks read it in a slightly more indeterminable way in terms of the path forward.
Maybe starting this conversation with criticism, and maybe that idea that you introduce, on page 8, like I said, colored the way I read the rest of the book. In that, in many ways, what I was taking from the book is that this is not just a book of tech criticism, but this is also a meta book about how we talk about tech.
Hmm.
And the book is structured as a series of sort of you dismantling myths in kind of techno utopianism. And so each chapter is a kind of inverse of that. Computers can't think. The internet is not a thing. Technical solutions won't solve social problems. Technology isn't given, it's made. And one of the ways that you talk about this is that you say that we kind of all tech criticism is kind of on this binary right now. You are either a tech utopianism or you are completely anti-tech. You
Hmm.
are, you want to avoid all of it. Luddite, all of that. And you're kind of saying, my reading is that there's more nuance there, that it is not just this binary. You define yourself as a techno progressivist in the book. And so maybe we start there to dig into
Hmm.
the book itself. What is a techno progressivist? How is that different than a techno utopian, techno determinist, or a
Hmm.
Luddite? Tell me about that difference.
Yeah, so the techno progressivism that I think about is exactly between those two poles, right? It's supposed to be a synthesis of the idea of the techno utopian and obviously the sort of tech critic, right? And what I argue throughout the book and what I think is captured in the idea of being techno progressive is that it's not so much the tools themselves or abstract metonyms like Silicon Valley or capitalism. It's actually the people and the minds and the social formations that are actually building this stuff, right? Like that is the
Yeah.
audience that I want to get at. So I think both sides on that spectrum are guilty of the same sort of abstractions, right? So to be anti-tech and to fetishize the computer or the algorithm as having some sort of political logic, there's a very interesting conversation to be had there. But what my book is trying to do is saying, no, we need to go to the people underneath
Right.
these processes, right? So, back to the whole point of language being the most important technology. If we can communicate to the the people with political aspirations, political ideas, we can kind of reach this middle ground where we don't need to demonize technology, we don't need to demonize Silicon Valley. We just need to break down what it is exactly that we take issue with. And so, to this point about the Mark Andreessens and the VC and the EAAC people who are, think that we are word cells and Luddites and I think what do they call us? They call us trad. I think it's something like
Oh, I
something.
haven't heard this.
Yeah, no, they call us. I think they call us. Well, they call us word cells, but then they also call us degrowth. I think it's
Oh,
it's
right,
basically
right.
it's basically this idea that decells. That's what it is.
Okay.
It's this idea that the critic wants to decelerate, or the critic is an enemy of progress.
Right.
I think techno progressivism says no. Let's take a little bit from both columns here, right? So technology in techno progressivism can obviously improve various parts of our life if we deploy it in a way that is, I think, cognizant of the trade-offs, right? So it's not a blanket dismissal of technological progress. It is simply a way to say technological progress should be built on top of, I think, healthier institutions, and it should not be destructive to current institutions as a la the sort of venture capital view of technology, where it should sort of eat everything, grow at all costs, and no one can ask questions. So for me, techno progressivism is to say you can be a critical techno progressivist, still build, but also engage in this kind of critical dialogue that I do in the book and many others have done in the sort of backlash to Silicon Valley.
You brought up Mark Andreessen, who's like a great example. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm thinking about his techno optimist manifesto, where he has that line where he's like, advances in AI will eradicate these diseases, will cure cancer, and anyone who stands in that way will have like blood on their hands. That's not
Yeah,
exactly his phrasing, but it
pretty
is
much.
that
Yeah, yeah,
all or nothing kind of mentality, and you're kind of
yeah.
going in between that a little bit. You mentioned earlier that we should spend less time talking about the tech itself, the products itself, and more talk about the ideas behind it. And you write a lot in the book about the ideology of Silicon Valley. Can you talk to me about what you see as the ideology of Silicon Valley, or the ideology of this techno optimism that you're kind of scratching a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's probably laid out in, so for me the 10 counterpoints in the book are kind of the tenets of it, right? I think it is something that I've seen. It's funny because it obviously the basis is the idea of the California ideology, which is goes back to the 90s. I think of Wired magazine.
Hmm.
I think of just in general this mix of cyber space, cyber utopian, cyber libertarian kind of views that computer networks and computation will liberate us from institutions or liberate us from the state, what have you, depending on your view, you can kind of choose. I feel like there's definitely the ideological antecedent there, which is very much alive and well. But for me, working in tech for I guess almost 15 or 20 years, it's kind of morphed into this new, very recent formation. I mean, I think about the pieces. There's a few real big tenets here that are not necessarily in those 10 chapters of the book. I mean, one of them is just basically this idea of growth for growth's sake, and
Right.
sort of growth at all costs mentality. I think obviously we know all the companies that did that, right? We've heard all the stories. We've heard of the Ubers and the Facebooks and everything else, and every other platform. Essentially, its only goal is basically growth and monopoly. I think that actually does have a more deep-seated um, personal ideological sort of seat in the kind of everyday things you hear and see around Silicon Valley or when you work in tech, right? So, like all ideologies, it's very subtle, right? It doesn't really manifest
Hmm.
itself. A lot of it is kind of hidden in your unhidden assumptions about what is right or where there's an ethical line in deploying a piece of software. I think another aspect I would just point on briefly is, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but this idea of the sort of the engineering mindset, I think, is a huge part of the contemporary
Yeah.
ideology
Yeah.
here. Like this idea that an engineer is given a problem, or a blueprint, or given a problem, and they say solve this, right? And so
Yeah.
an engineer is not trained to necessarily think critically. An engineer is given certain constraints to perform the task. And in computing, a lot of it is basically, can we do it faster? Can we do it elegantly? Can we do it with low resources? All these sort of things that are set to them by someone else, right? For me, usually that someone else is either the capitalist or the client, or someone giving them the problem, giving them the design. For me, it's very interesting. I feel like we've had an inversion very recently where the engineering mindset, this idea that there is a problem, we must now go solve it, almost skips that earlier step of thinking of the why, of the plan,
Right.
of the what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? So you have a lot of these, and now this will definitely bleed into the world of AI, where you sort of have like a hammer looking for a nail in a lot of different worlds, and I think that hammer looking for a nail to me is part of the engineering mindset, sort of taking command throughout society.
That reminds me of there was the kind of conceptual experimental architect Cedric Price, who has a line, technology was the answer, but what was the question?
Yeah,
And
there you go.
that's that
Yeah.
engineering mindset that you're talking about. I want to talk more about that, but I want to just ask you to talk a little bit more about this idea of ideology in Silicon Valley. And you mentioned the growth at all costs mindset. And I'm wondering how much you think, and again, I realize this might be a broad brush. This is not really something that you talk explicitly about in the book, How much of this techno-optimist thinking is rooted in a belief that these things will make the world a better place, that it will solve all of these things, and how much of it is marketing speak? How much of this
Yep.
is actually just growth at all costs? Is there a way we can pick that apart?
Yeah.
And I realize that's a broad question, and there's a lot of
No, I know.
people and a lot of companies. But how do you think about actual sort of ideologies versus just kind of marketing language?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked this. It is a massive topic. It could be a book in itself, and I think we should get into it. I think so. Let me start with one thing you said, right? I think I sort of I attempt to separate out whenever I say ideology, I mean two things. I mean, there are the true believers,
Right.
right? There are the people who are the super fans of technology. I think they manifest themselves in a lot of other hyper contemporary ways, or people that really do believe that whether it's the singularity is coming, whether it's AGI is coming, or whether it's just this like base knee-jerk reaction that like anything that Silicon Valley or anything that's digitized is better and will liberate us. Like there are some true believers there. Then I think there's a massive like superstructure here around basically Wall Street or the marketing narrative that is woven has to kind of like tell a bigger story, and it's really no one actually believes it, but it just kind of like helps grease the
Yeah.
wheels of getting things done. It's also a D2C marketing play. It's this idea. I mean, almost every single. I mean, we talked about this. I essentially work in marketing, and that is really where a lot of this comes out. I actually
Hmm.
halfway through writing this book, I was like, you know what? I actually think it's the humanities people that went to go to work in Silicon Valley in the marketing departments that are more to blame for some of this stuff than it
Oh,
is
that's a hot take.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think because it's like I think of all the because like I mean it's been communicated so perfectly, right? It's
Yeah.
been it's been it's that narrative won, right? I mean, the idea, I mean, I think of like the early days of Apple, I think of all these things like that ideological takeover was pretty much installed pretty well. Like it's got all of us believing, right? And that is, yeah, that's the marketing
Yeah,
department.
I talk with my design students all the time about the masterful branding around AI, and even just this word hallucination.
Yeah.
That an AI hallucinates, which gives it a magical, mystical quality, when really all a hallucination is a bug. It's a
Yeah, it's a
wrong answer.
statistical. Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, that's marketing language that, gives it something, that it doesn't. It gives it wisdom. It makes it sound
Right.
mystical in a way that it doesn't. I want to go back to this idea of ideology for a second and connect that to the technology a little bit. And you mentioned earlier that we spend too much time, you think, talking about the tech itself, talking about the algorithms, talking about the products themselves. And we should spend more time talking about the organizations, the institutions, the ideologies that inform those things. You write in the book, we should focus less on the nuts and bolts of algorithms and instead scrutinize the organizational form that builds and deploys them. And this is ostensibly a design podcast, and I always like to define design as ideology made artifact. It is taking points of view, ways of seeing beliefs, and making them real in some way, making them concrete, giving them form. And I'm wondering if you see, or if you could talk about the ways that these ideologies are actually manifested in the design of these platforms, in the creation of these platforms. Can you talk about that connection from the true believers, what they actually believe, to how that actually is revealed in the product?
Yeah, that's another big one. I mean, so right now Substack is on my mind a lot
Mm.
because I joined Substack. It's having somewhat of a moment, both negative and positive. And when I think of Substack, I think of like one of the really good object lessons in designing for a problem, or is it making the problem worse, right? So let me just give the overall brief of Substack, right? In my mind, it is we're tired of writing, we're tired of creating for free. We want to liberate creators to have a direct subscription model. We want to provide that infrastructure to make that a reality. Why? Because traditional media is dying.
Right.
Traditional media is no longer able to really uphold the this ideal of journalism. So we want to provide essentially a coping mechanism for a dying media industry, right? What happens though is they're not building a media industry or building media institutions, they're building a platform. And to your point, where exactly does that manifest in the design decisions? Well, it's everywhere you look, right? It's
Right.
it's in the way that, I mean, first of all, I've received several emails from Substack so far since joining them on how to grow. The word
Right,
growth,
right, right.
I never received emails from my publishers about growth and that thing. So clearly growth is on their minds, but they also want it
Hmm.
to be in your minds too, right?
Right.
They want you to be the entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur now. You're not a writer. You're not a journalist. You kind of got to do this. You got to kind of do all the entrepreneurial stuff as
Hmm.
well. When I think of the interface for the reader, it's constantly doing notifications, or it's constantly doing the recommendation structure that they have. It's designed to have some of these like sort of sticky dark patterns that get you to essentially load up on as much content as you want, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but think about it. Who really wants that, right? I mean, it does have this underlying idea of the feed, or it does have this underlying idea of consume, 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 and less about this idea of I'm picking up a magazine, and not to be skeuomorphic about it or whatever, but it's like, I'm picking up a magazine, I pay for this, and I just want to read this, and my world is built by this magazine or this publication and this writer that I
Hmm.
like. They have this idea that it's just going to be this trough of good journalism and good writers that they're supporting. But that brings me to my final thing around the overall org design, or the overall kind of design of what is being done for the writer. Economically, it doesn't seem to really make much sense, right? Because I find that what it does is it manifests this idea of a star system, right? So to really make a living off of this, you have to be in like the sort of top 1 or 2 or 3% of creators, and there are many success stories about that. But what you have in like the big middle or like the long tail are people that either aren't paying for anyone, and aren't supporting anyone, and aren't getting paid by anyone either. And I think that whole point, the idea that they have that huge base there is to me showing that they don't necessarily care about the problem, or they don't necessarily think about the problem. They're just essentially building a new platform, right?
I mean, it's making me think about what you just said about, in some ways, maybe it's all those people that came from the humanities and the marketers, that they're actually the ones that, should
Yeah.
be blamed. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking like, actually, maybe the designers, maybe the graphic designers are part of this problem also, because we are the ones who are making these products sticky. We're making them,
Yeah.
addictive. We're making them seamless. We're making it easy for you to do these things, so you keep coming back to it. Yeah, I talked to James Bridle a couple months ago about their new book. We talk about this idea that a lot of what we call human-centered design is really just corporation-centered design.
Yeah.
It appears that it's being designed to solve your problem as the user,
Right.
but it's also padding the bottom
Yeah.
line of the corporation.
Yeah, that's a perfect summary of what I was just basically saying. I think that's where it starts to manifest itself. And yeah, I think there's a lot of different things smuggled in there with these ideas of design and user-centered design that, we should always be unpacking.
Tell me more about this myth: technological solutions can't solve cultural problems. Or that's actually not the myth. That's your
Mhm.
sort of counter of the myth, I guess I should say. But I think this is one that is feeling more and more urgent to me
Mhm.
in the way Silicon Valley, the way these tech companies have invaded so much of our
Mhm.
culture. And we can, if you want, we can get into whatever Elon Musk is doing right now. But this idea of tech solving cultural problems.
Mhm.
Tell me about that problem and how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, well, I think that the idea of the techno fix, as I talk about in the book, goes back a long way, right? It's an idea that, and also dovetails kind of what we were saying before with the whole engineering mindset, right?
Hmm.
An
Hmm.
engineer is given a problem, and they fix it. Usually, what they're doing is they're fixing a topical, local manifestation of the problem, and they're not looking a few layers deep at what's potentially upstream from the problem, right? And I think the reason why this has taken such a stranglehold on our cultural imagination now is because everything has to be so fast. Everything has to be
Mm.
quick. And I also think we're pretty exhausted with the political process in this country, and really in most countries, around its inability to actually manifest a democratic consensus and then act on it, right? And that's a whole other sort of corruption of various different governmental institutions. So the techno fix comes in and says, "Oh, we're gonna lower the crime rate in your neighborhood. How are we going to do that? We found that crime seems to go up when it's hot. That's actually probably empirically a correct finding, right? So what is the solution then based on that empirical data science that we did? Oh, well, let's just make it cooler, right? And then crime goes down, right? It's like, well, what the technofix never looks at like three or four steps behind the problem. They never understand what are the murkier and harder to pin down reasons for crime because that conversation is not a technical conversation. That conversation is a social conversation, and then you've left the purview of the digital platform, or you've left the purview of the technician or the engineer, right? So I think what's happening is as we have the pretty slow erosion of the democratic consensus and the ability to fix problems from non-technical means, the tech side comes in, and we've given more and more. And we've had fascinating devices that have solved many problems for us. And as I say, as a techno progressivist, are amazing and great. I'm glad I live in that world. But the problem is when that tips a little bit too far and starts to become, okay, well, now these folks can fix everything for us. It's about having that membrane to say, well, this is a political problem and it should be adjudicated by the political body because it serves the polis, for lack of a better term. Like, it serves
Yeah,
the
yeah.
people, not, as you were saying before, who are you designing for? The user, the citizen? No, you are designing for the client. You're designing for the platform. You're designing for your investor.
What I did not expect when I was reading the book is that this would be a book in defense of institutions. That it would be a call for strengthening of institutions. And you write that in many ways, the reason these platforms have gotten so popular, and you just said this in this conversation, is a weakening of democratic institutions. And so I have a sort of two-part question. Can you just talk about the difference between a platform and an institution? You have a chapter in the book also called Platforms Are Not Institutions, but talk about that for listeners. And then what can institutions do that platforms can't?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is an ongoing project I have around this. I think I don't want to call it, it's not a dichotomy. I'd say it's essentially a spectrum, or at least what I'm proposing could be a new framework to think about the future, which is um, historically, platforms for me have come in to institutions. They've said, how can we make this faster, bring it online? How can we digitize this? That seems pretty normal in terms of the progression of, obviously taking a new tool and applying it to the substance of some institution. But what I think happened along the way was a separate, again, cultural and social and ideological thing where they said, okay, not only are we going to, get you a cab faster, now the cabbie is going to be on this platform, and they're going to be a 1099 contractor, and
Right,
it's
right,
essentially going to be a labor innovation that we're doing as well here. And
right.
that's what I mean by platform, right? So a platform goes in to any kind of formation or activity, and it basically does a few things. I think it's defined by being asynchronous, right? So the idea that it can speed up the clock at which something gets delivered, right? So if you think
Mhm.
of Twitter and all digital media RSS feeds versus, say, the production and the publishing of news, right? It used to be that there was a sort of clock that a journalist institution had, and that was set by the journalistic institution. If it's a weekly, it's a weekly. If it's a monthly, it's a monthly. If it's breaking news all the time, it's breaking news all the time. And that's because they had to calibrate for the work and the labor, right? A platform says, let's aggregate it. And again, using the powers of essentially digital media and software, which we all know about, it essentially says we can put this on a platform, right? And what that platform does is the other aspect of it is it does not so much care about the provenance of said content. It doesn't even really care about the content that's hosted on it. It doesn't
Mm,
necessarily have a perspective or a point of view on what it hosts on its rails on the platform. It just matters that it's on the platform or it's on its rails,
right.
right? So platforms want to become the silent infrastructure of our everyday life. And I realize I'm referring now to like multiple different platforms, but the platform ideology itself.
Right, right.
And they do that because that is the lowest risk way to grow, right? I think this is something that comes directly from the venture capital mantra of essentially go into a problem or go into something that can be optimized and optimize it. And the answer to that optimization was essentially a platform of various different
Right.
types. And the reason why is because it's the lowest risk way to profit. Um,
Mm,
and it's not like, and I think the other aspect is I think that platforms also have this aspect where they essentially, going back to our growth at all costs mantra, I do think that it's not as much growth at all costs. Platforms mainly are focusing not on the thing that is being transmitted or the mission behind the content. They care about computation for computation's sake and
yeah.
scaling. So
Right. The
if something
sustaining
doesn't,
its own self
right.
in some way. Yeah, that's
Right. So it's
interesting.
about scale. I'd say going back to the institution briefly, one more point. I mean, institutions, the beauty about them, which I don't think is celebrated enough, is, and not in like a small, small is better or anti-growth way, but institutions don't necessarily care about scale because scale might not be in the interest of the users of the institution. So the platform sort of just assumes that scale is good for everyone, and thus
Mm.
the structure and the design follows that.
I'm interested in this idea that the platforms were able to grow because of a weakening of institutions. And I'm wondering how we start to counter that or turn that. And I realize we started this conversation saying you're not providing solutions. I'm not asking you to give answers here, but I'm thinking about when I talk about these ideas with my students,
Mhm.
who are going into a design industry that in
Yeah.
many ways has been completely taken over by the tech world.
Hmm.
Most of them will go work as product designers
Right.
somewhere. Um, how do we think about rebuilding institutions in a world where the platforms are already so powerful?
My positive view of the future for institutions is one that does not reject technology or does not sort of double down on being Luddite. It's one that finds a productive interplay between software, digital media, and the internet,
Mm,
and adopts those, but adopts those and designs those into their activity or into their structure in a way that does not deinstitutionalize the institution, right?
right.
So I think there's a positive way forward where institutions shouldn't be thought of as going backward, or when we say institution, it's not a pre-social media formation by any chance. It's essentially saying that we can think about the mission and the point of an institution and still sort of build, new processes into that. That's really kind of the vision. And I
Yeah.
think the most important thing to do in order to combat that is to not just assume that every institution must be platformed or the way forward is the platform, because that's the current thinking. The current thinking is the way forward is to make everything a platform, and that's essentially the outcome of our current, techno-utopian ideology.
And I guess to go back to what you were saying about an instant or a platform sort of existing to just perpetuate the platform, what an institution can do is institutions are built collectively. They are built in service of something as opposed to a platform where things just come and go, where stuff is just posted and not
Mhm.
posted, and there's no kind of coherent mission, right?
Yeah, this always seems to come up at the end of whenever I talk about institutions, but something I've been noticing recently I wanted to sound off on. So I've noticed a lot about this idea of the archive, right? And this
Mm,
idea of preservation. And I think another really important thing that we forget about institutions is they do care about the preservation and the history of what they do.
mm,
And they're structured that way because they're meant to be permanent, right?
right.
I think we don't think about that enough. Like the idea of something being permanent isn't necessarily a anti-growth or anti-tech kind of view. For me, platforms, we should realize that platforms are all ephemeral, right? Like no one here is saying that, No one here is saying that we're archiving Facebook and and X and all these different companies
Right.
that come up. Like
Right.
they're meant to kind of be discarded as soon as they're not useful, right? So what does the future look like when we just have a bunch of like discarded platforms that now do the work of our old institutions, and we have to go back and say, hey, what happened in this 10-year period, right? I think actually James
Yeah.
Bridle talks about this a lot in the New Dark
Yeah.
Age, right? I
Yeah.
think. So yeah, so like I just wanted to hit on that point. Like institutions, it's not bad that they want to be permanent. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's actually I'm really glad that you said that because that I was trying to find a way to connect this to your sort of parallel work. So this is a book of technology criticism. You work in tech, but you have this parallel career as a art critic, as an art writer. You've written for Frieze, for Artforum. What's the overlap between writing about art and writing about platforms? How does that background in art criticism influence the way you think about writing tech criticism? How do those start to talk to each other?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a bit of a backstory. So I mean, I basically was writing art criticism and mostly contemporary art criticism. I gravitated towards work at the often maligned intersection of art and technology. And because I found that was what most of my peers were doing, and that's what sort of the most urgent political problem for art to take on was. And so I kind of immersed myself in like I guess both the study slash the milieu of artists working at this intersection. I've always been someone that believes that art and art criticism have a political role to play. And that doesn't mean that every artist that works with technology has to be critical of tech or has to be political in themselves. But for me, that problem was the most interesting problem motivating, the kind of cultural discourse at the time. And also at this time, I've always had a kind of interest in institutional critique, right?
Mhm.
The classic, like I say classic, but the
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Okay.
yeah, the pretty standard I guess you could call it like a discourse, but it's also kind of like it's even like a school of art practice of institutional critique. So like those were kind of like my favorite things to play around with as an art critic. And then I started to realize, I'm living in a wild time right now. Like I think I should slowly migrate my discussions and my critical work from potential ideologies that you unpack in art criticism and in art towards this giant cultural object that we're living in now, which is essentially Silicon Valley, which
Mhm.
essentially became more and more of the cultural hegemon as my
Yeah.
early 20s went on. So I kind of shifted for a moment. I said, what does it mean to be a critic of that kind of intersection of art and technology, and what does it mean eventually for this book, essentially just to focus most of the critical faculties on the ideology of digital utopianism in Silicon Valley itself. So that's kind of how the process went. But along the way I basically, I guess my first full entrance into it was, my question that I posed, is a museum a database, right? So
Right.
thinking about the history of the archive, thinking about the institutional role of the cultural institution, which again, here we are pretty much specifically talking about the museum. And at this time, it was probably 2010s, let's call it, was a time where I saw some of the biggest cheerleaders of this like techno utopianism were oddly enough like cultural institutions, and I
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
remember hearing a lot of like the same stuff you'd hear in the marketing copy from tech companies. You'd all of a sudden hear in cultural institutions. So I try to start to think about like what's really at stake there, and um, you know. t- how is the museum responding to this massive competitor of
Yeah.
basically completely free digital media online? And what is that world of images looking like? And how is it kind of not so much threatening, but like how is there an interplay between the role of the cultural institution and essentially yeah, pretty much the internet. So I kind of asked this provocative question to really get at the heart of what an institution will do in this sort of utopian moment.
You wrote about that in 2016 for Art in America in a piece called Silicon Values, where you were looking at New Inc., which is the New Museum's incubator, and you kind of critique this idea of the new museum using all the language of Silicon Valley, of entrepreneurship in some way. And as I was reading that piece and thinking about your book, I was also thinking about the flip side of what you just said and what you wrote in that piece, where yes, art institutions are adopting the language and or were adopting the language, sort of, buying into this. But then there's this other side where all the tech companies were sort of using art
Yeah.
to gain cultural currency. And I worked at Facebook, almost 15 years ago now at this point, I guess. And I think about like their artists in residence program,
Mhm.
and every tech company has one of these, or like, Facebook's analog research lab, which is, sort of an in-house propaganda machine making, art posters that go up around campus. But I'm also thinking about like Stripe and how they have Stripe Press and are
Mhm.
publishing books. How do you think about how Silicon Valley and technology is uh, using these cultural modes, publishing, art making, residencies? Why are they doing that? To what ends are they doing that? How does that fit into this ideology of Silicon Valley that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question, and I often think that Silicon Valley is very confounded by the artist, the figure of the artist, right? They're almost jealous in a way. I think they look at the artist that almost actually does something that they sort of speak about and talk about in this ideal
Mm,
sense, right? Like
uh,
they I think that, and by the way, I think it's very interesting to think about AI here, right? Because I think how interesting is it that you have this explosion of the large language models and obviously things like DALL-E. And it almost instantly, before it really does anything useful for businesses, it just goes right to art, right?
right, right.
It goes right to writing poetry and image making, and then we have this conversation all very very quickly. I'll say this: I think that um, Silicon Valley needs the arts and the humanities. They need to forge a connection there because that is one of the ways which they will essentially, like you said, propagandize or convince us that this is fuzzy, this is human, this is for
Right,
you.
right.
So they use the institutions of art, or they use the institution of art itself. They use the artist as this like interloper, and I find that sometimes it's quite. I mean, you could say that that's a cynical take on it, but I do think that's really what's happening. Like, do they really want to? Does the Facebook Artists in Residency program really want to do to artists what traditional cultural institutions did? I think the answer is no. They clearly have different incentives. They clearly have different structures to why they're supporting this art, and so it's up to the artist to ask, who is the better, right? Who like which future do you want, right? And look, cultural institutions are in a terrible spot right now. They have been degraded by various different kind of developments, only a few of which are sort of have to do with Silicon Valley and technology. So, they're really put in this tough spot. I think that there's also this heroic idea here that like Silicon Valley, as we've talked about before, can democratize the arts, can make everyone into an artist, can smash down the gates and basically make it so that anyone can create and anyone's free to do that. And that's been sort of one of the foundational myths of the internet itself, is kind of like smashing the gates of the institution. But yeah, I think that tech needs art more than art needs tech. Basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's well
You know
said.
what I
I think
mean?
that's
Do
well
you know,
said. Yeah.
like specifically with art, like I just find maybe it's a little bit of cynical take, but like the whole entree into using AI to make art is simply just a way to demonstrate the capabilities of the AI in a way
Right,
that is a lot more popular and interesting than it is showing that you can optimize the supply chain of a company in Ohio. Like that's what AI was supposed to do, right?
right.
AI was supposed to make like really complex business processes harder. It wasn't supposed to like kind of make fantastical art. Like we're supposed to make the fantastical art, right? Like I thought that's what we were supposed to do. So
Yeah.
so yeah, Silicon Valley uses the artist to essentially make this case because that's the one that people will react to. That will resonate with people.
It strikes me you've been thinking about this book for like 10 years, I think I heard you say in an interview. And the book came out at the beginning of the year, and it feels like a very timely book, as like I mentioned earlier, as Elon Musk has a plum position in this administration and is kind of taking Silicon Valley ideology, process, engineering mindset, growth at all costs, everything that we're talking about, and basically kind of taking over all of our democratic institutions. Has watching the last 2 months changed anything anything about how you think about what's in this book, or are there? You're writing the book now, seeing everything else. What
Mhm.
new would you add to it? Can you just sort of talk to me about how kind of everything that's happened in the last,
Mm.
let's say since the election, um, which to me speaks so much to much of the ideology that you write about in the book.
Yeah. So I think there's a trap here. I agree with the ways in which the post inauguration slash post election potentially was. You could see the antecedents of that in the book, but that was not my focus. I was very intentional to try to break our idea of right and left and Republican Democrat when we think about technology. Like the way to unseat this ideology is not to say that it's simply bad because it's right wing. It's simply bad because it's MAGA, right?
Right.
Um, there was a blue. I mean, again, to use the American term, sorry, but there was a blue version of this type of techno utopianism. It just didn't manifest itself the same way, right? Like you can commit the Elon Musk sins of what he's doing in a democratic administration and even in a left communist kind of way, right? So for me, it's there's a trap that I didn't want to fall into to say that we should resist this because it ends up becoming this it's this path towards this kind of, I mean, what I think is potentially like a unfolding dictatorship, but hopefully
Right.
not. And I actually just wrote something about this because reflecting on your exact question, I think that what I wanted to do was say, think of the political polarities as platformism, or the idea that platforms are essentially the most ideal form to organize and administer society. Think of that as the ideology that you're worried about, right? So when I see Elon Musk essentially committing platformism as our de facto federal government, right? Yes, he 100% traffics in old school right wing stuff, small government, libertarianism. Clearly he's on this kind of like anti woke thing, which I think he just kind of uses as a way to kind of get in with the MAGA
Mhm.
folks. Um, there's potentially this kind of America First idea. So yes, you can plot some of the stuff that's happening with the tech right marriage on the traditional political spectrum. But what I hope we do, and again, not that I'm a centrist by any means, but what I hope the book does is kind of unite more people that you all have something to
R-
lose. Like you
Right.
all sort of, and I think actually people on the right are starting to see this, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
they're like all the federal government, these federal government workers potentially are the biggest MAGA people in the world, but they have a federal job and that's their wage. So they're starting to see people across the aisle should be or across the political spectrum should be alarmed at the rise of this kind of platform digital utopianism. And it's not just about that, oh, the left will do this better, or this is going to defeat the left.
Right. I think that's right. And I wasn't trying to make a left right
Oh yeah,
argument
yeah,
there,
yeah.
but I think the way that you said that is right. I think it is really a are you I'm oversimplifying here, but I think like are you for the platforms or against the platforms? Another way you could say that's like are you for centralized power
Right, yeah,
or not? And that's sort of I guess what I was interested in is that this
yeah,
idea of the platforms existing to just give more power to themselves. We're sort of seeing that play out at a
right.
large scale right now.
It's so hard to talk about the Doge stuff because it's such an incoherent mix of things going on. Like I found this every time I talk about it, you just get tripped up, right? So it's
Right.
like you have all these different politicals, it's almost like we need like a
Yeah, yeah.
seven-dimensional thing to really work this out, right? Because yeah, I mean you're right. It's like in one way they are empower. They're using state power, right? They are you. It contradicts the sort of techno-libertarian idea because it's using state power. And my answer to this, just so we have some sort of resolution, because I think it is important for people to like think about this in a certain type of way, is I just think that I would I would match this under both Trump and Elon Musk and Silicon Valley's idea at growth at all costs. Like they want
Yeah.
power, right? They
Yeah.
just they want to just increase power. Like this is a de-risking venture capital move to essentially go in and say, hey, the state can be the new client,
Exactly.
or let's clear the way for the state. And I think Mark Andreessen has been clear about this too, right? There is now this new political movement by Silicon Valley to look at the government as one more layer in the stack, right? So
Yes, that's exactly what I was
yeah,
that's the question that I was asking, I guess, is like, yeah, what we're now seeing is that the platform is not just something technological,
yeah,
but that, the nation state could be a platform. What happens when that becomes a platform? I think that's really well said. My last question, to try to end this not too much of a negative note, I want to circle back to criticism to end. And I'm wondering, as a writer, as a critic, as somebody who is both in this world and thinking about this world, where else do you want to see other writers and critics focusing attention, or where do you think, what parts of this world, what parts of this discussion have not been thought about enough, have not been written about enough? Where should our gaze go next?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think my plea for what I tried to do in this book, or what I do and what I want more people to do, is to think of the critique of technology in a way that is not itself wrapped up in techno-utopianism and the techno fix. So I think where the book deviates from a lot of current tech criticism is that it looks at the foundational ideological assumptions of Silicon Valley and the platforms we use. And instead of proposing a fix, which is a better platform or a
Right.
more kind Spotify or a less racist Twitter, which of course we all want those things. But for me, it is going way deeper and saying, let's rethink what it means to be a platform and an institution. And let's not just simply patch fix it. Let's try as best we can to really start at first principles and say, what do we want from the future? What do we want from future organizations? So that's really the positive spin I put on it. I think we can do that. I think we need to get out of the doom loop of simply looking for another solution from the same people who have essentially gotten us into this situation. And while that might sound pie in the sky, I fundamentally believe that if we can start to change the way that people think about these problems, it's something that can be part of our future.
The book is called Against Platform Surviving Digital Utopia. It is a book of tech criticism. It is a book about technology, but I think, as I hope comes through in this conversation, it's much more than that. To me, this is a book of cultural criticism. This is a
Mhm.
political project. This is a book about how we actually talk about these things, giving us sort of new language to talk about these things. I found it very profound and very interesting. I found this conversation equally fascinating. So, Mike, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
And that was my conversation with Mike Pepi. His new book, Against Platforms, is available wherever books were sold. This conversation was recorded on February 14th, 2025. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast and listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.